In the early 1980s, Belgium, a small nation often celebrated for its waffles, chocolate, and quaint cobblestone streets, found itself plunged into a nightmare that would haunt its collective memory for decades. Between 1982 and 1985, a group of criminals, later dubbed the Brabant Killers or the Gang of Nijvel, unleashed a wave of brutal violence that left the country reeling. Over the course of 17 known attacks, they killed 28 people and injured more than 40, targeting supermarkets, jewelry stores, restaurants, and even a taxi driver in a series of seemingly random, yet meticulously planned assaults. The gang's reign of terror, marked by military precision and a chilling disregard for human life, turned everyday places into scenes of horror, leaving behind a trail of grief and unanswered questions that persist to this day. The Brabant Killers struck with a ferocity that was as shocking as it was incomprehensible. Their attacks often began with a burst of gunfire, the masked gunmen wielding pump-action shotguns and automatic weapons, their movements swift and coordinated. They targeted small-town supermarkets like the Delhaize stores in Aalst, Beersel, and Overijse, where they would storm in, terrorize customers and staff, and escape with modest sums of money, sometimes as little as a few thousand Belgian francs, equivalent to a few hundred euros today. But the brutality far outweighed the gains. In Aalst on November 9, 1985, one of their deadliest raids, they killed 8 people, including a 9-year-old girl shot point-blank as she clung to her mother, leaving the town in a state of collective trauma. The killers' apparent lack of motive beyond petty theft baffled investigators and fueled speculation about deeper, darker agendas. Belgium in the 1980s was a country already grappling with social and political tensions, a backdrop that amplified the impact of the Brabant Killers' crimes. The Cold War loomed large, with fears of communist subversion and far-right extremism simmering beneath the surface. The nation was divided linguistically and politically, with the Flemish and Walloon communities often at odds, and the government struggled with corruption scandals and inefficiency. Against this fractured landscape, the killers operated with impunity, their attacks exposing the vulnerabilities of a justice system ill-equipped to handle such a sophisticated and ruthless threat. Rumors swirled that the gang had ties to the Belgian State Security Service, the military, or even NATO's secret Gladio network, a stay-behind operation meant to resist a Soviet invasion, leading to theories of a conspiracy to destabilize the country and justify a crackdown on civil liberties. The Brabant Killers' reign of terror left an indelible mark on Belgian society, sowing fear in places that had once felt safe. Parents hesitated to take their children to the supermarket, and small business owners lived in dread of becoming the next target. The gang's ability to evade capture, despite extensive manhunts and public outcry, deepened the sense of helplessness. Witnesses described the killers as tall, athletic men, often wearing carnival masks or balaclavas, speaking French with a mix of accents. Some thought they detected a hint of Flemish, others a foreign inflection. But these descriptions led nowhere. The gang vanished after their final attack in Aalst, leaving behind a mystery that has confounded investigators for over 4 decades. By April 2025, the case remains officially unsolved, though a breakthrough in 2017, when a former gendarme confessed on his deathbed to being the Giant, a key member of the gang, offered a glimmer of hope, only to be mired in further controversy and legal dead ends. This story follows the Brabant Killers' campaign of terror through the eyes of those who lived in its shadow. A young mother who survived the Aalst massacre but lost her daughter, a detective whose obsession with the case cost him his family, and a journalist determined to uncover the truth, even as it leads her into dangerous territory. It explores the themes of fear, as a nation grapples with an unseen enemy, justice as investigators and survivors seek answers in a maze of corruption and conspiracy, and resilience as communities band together to heal. The Brabant Killers' legacy is one of loss, but also of the enduring human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those who refuse to let fear win, who fight for truth, and who hold on to hope that justice, however delayed, will one day be served. The Shadow of the Brabant Killers, a tale of fear and justice. Chapter 1, The First Shots. In the autumn of 1982, Belgium was a country on the cusp of change, its people navigating the complexities of a divided nation while clinging to the comforting routines of daily life. But beneath the surface of this small, unassuming country, a darkness was stirring, one that would soon erupt into a wave of violence that would leave an indelible mark on its history. The Brabant Killers, as they would later be known, began their campaign of terror with a series of seemingly petty crimes that belied the brutality to come. This chapter traces the early days of their reign, introducing the lives they touched: a young mother in a quiet suburb, a determined detective in Brussels, and a curious journalist in Antwerp, while capturing the first ripples of fear that would soon engulf the nation in a nightmare of uncertainty and loss. It was a chilly October evening in Dwerp, a small village south of Brussels, when the Brabant Killers made their first known move. On October 2nd, 1982, three masked men armed with a 9mm pistol and a shotgun broke into the home of a local arms dealer, Joseph van den Steen. The 52-year-old dealer, known for supplying weapons to hunters and collectors, was in his workshop when the intruders burst in, their faces hidden behind balaclavas, their movements swift and precise. They demanded his stock of firearms, but Van den Steen resisted, a decision that cost him dearly. The men shot him in the chest, leaving him bleeding on the floor as they ransacked the shop, stealing 10 shotguns, several rifles, and a cache of ammunition. Van den Steen survived, but the attack sent a chill through the community, a warning of the violence that was to come. In nearby beer cell, 28-year-old Elise Martins was preparing dinner in her modest kitchen, unaware that the events in Dwerp would soon ripple into her life. Elise, a single mother to her 4-year-old daughter, Clara, worked as a cashier at the local Delhaize supermarket, a job that gave her just enough to pay the rent on their small apartment. She had heard whispers of the break-in on the radio that morning, but it felt distant, the kind of crime that happened to other people in other places. "It's terrible, but it's not here," she told her neighbor, Marie, as they sipped tea on the balcony, Clara playing with a doll at their feet. Elise's life was one of quiet routine. She'd drop Clara off at daycare, work her shift, and spend her evenings reading bedtime stories, dreaming of a better future for her little girl. But the shadow of the Brabant Killers was creeping closer, and soon, her world would be turned upside down. In Brussels, Detective Pieter de Klerk was at his desk in the headquarters of the Belgian Federal Police, sifting through reports of recent crimes when news of the Dwerp robbery reached him. At 38, Pieter was a seasoned investigator with a reputation for dogged determination, his sharp mind honed by years of tackling Belgium's underworld. But this case felt different. The precision of the attack, the choice of target, and the sheer audacity of the robbers unsettled him. "These aren't your typical thieves," he told his partner, Luc Van Hove, as they reviewed the initial findings. "They went straight for the weapons, not the cash. That's not about profit, it's about preparation." Pieter's instincts told him this was the beginning of something bigger, a suspicion that would soon prove all too accurate. He requested the case be assigned to his unit, unaware that it would become the defining challenge of his career, one that would test his resolve and cost him more than he could imagine. Meanwhile, in Antwerp, 32-year-old journalist Annelies was at her desk at De Morgen, a progressive newspaper known for its investigative reporting. Annelies had a knack for uncovering stories that others overlooked, her curiosity often leading her into the darker corners of Belgian society. She had been following a series of minor break-ins across the Flemish Brabant region, noticing a pattern of increasing violence that most of her colleagues dismissed as coincidence. The Dwerp robbery caught her attention immediately. Arms dealers weren't typical targets for petty thieves, and the brutality of the attack suggested a level of organization that piqued her interest. "There's something here," she told her editor, Jan de Smet, as she pinned a map of the region to her cubicle wall, marking the locations of recent crimes with red pins. "These aren't random. They're building up to something." Jan, a gruff but supportive mentor, gave her the green light to dig deeper. a decision that would set Annelies on a path toward uncovering truths that some would kill to keep buried. The Brabant Killers' early crimes escalated quickly, each one more brazen than the last. On December 23, 1982, they struck again, this time targeting a small restaurant in Beercel called Auberge de Chevaliers, a cozy spot known for its hearty Flemish stews. The owner, 60-year-old Freddie Martins, no relation to Elise, had just closed up for the night when three men burst in, their faces obscured by carnival masks, one wielding a shotgun, another a pistol. They demanded the night's earnings, but Freddie, a stubborn man who had run the restaurant for decades, refused to comply. The leader, a tall man witnesses later described as the Giant due to his towering frame, shot Freddie in the stomach without hesitation, leaving him to bleed out on the floor as they fled with a meager 35,000 Belgian francs, about 900 euros in today's money. Freddie's death marked the gang's first confirmed killing, a grim milestone that signaled their willingness to take lives for little gain. The murder sent shockwaves through Beercel, a town unaccustomed to such violence. Elise, who knew Freddie through her work at the Delhaize, his restaurant often supplied baked goods to the store, felt a knot of dread in her stomach when she heard the news. She had seen Freddie just days before, joking about his famous rabbit stew as he dropped off a tray of bread. Now he was gone, killed in a robbery that made no sense. Why would they kill him for so little? She asked Marie, her voice trembling as she hugged Clara a little tighter that night. The fear was beginning to take root, a creeping unease that made her second-guess her evening walks to the store, her eyes darting to the shadows as she pushed Clara's stroller through the quiet streets. Pieter de Klerk was on the scene in Beercel within hours, his jaw tight as he surveyed the crime scene. The restaurant was a mess, tables overturned, blood pooling on the wooden floor where Freddie had fallen, a single shotgun shell casing glinting in the corner. Witnesses, a couple who had been walking their dog nearby, reported hearing gunfire and seeing three men speed off in a dark green Volkswagen Golf, a detail that matched descriptions from the Dwerp robbery. "It's the same crew," Pieter told Luke, his voice low but certain. "They're getting bolder." He interviewed Freddie's widow, Anna, who sat in the back room, her eyes red from crying, clutching a photo of her husband. "He didn't deserve this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He was a good man." Pieter promised her he'd find the killers, a promise he intended to keep, even as the case grew more complex with each passing day. Annelies Verhegen, following the story from Antwerp, arrived in Beercel the next morning, her notebook in hand as she interviewed locals. The town was on edge, shopkeepers closing early, parents keeping their children indoors. "It's like we're waiting for the next one," a baker told her, his hands trembling as he kneaded dough. Annelies spoke to a witness who had seen the getaway car, noting the description of the Giant. A man over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, speaking French with a slight accent. She added the detail to her growing file, her mind racing with possibilities. Was this gang connected to the political unrest of the time? The 1980s in Belgium were marked by the years of Lead, a period of tension fueled by Cold War fears, far-right extremism, and allegations of corruption within the police and military. Annelies had heard whispers of the Gladio Network, a secret NATO operation meant to resist a Soviet invasion, and wondered if the gang's military precision hinted at a deeper conspiracy. The Brabant Killers' early attacks, though small in scale, were a harbinger of the terror to come. On January 12, 1983, they struck again, this time at a taxi driver in Mons, shooting him in the head for his car, which they used in their next robbery, a jewelry store in Wavre. The pattern was emerging. Steal weapons, kill without hesitation, and disappear into the night. Pieter, poring over maps and witness statements in his Brussels office, felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. He had a young son, Thomas, just a year older than Clara, and the thought of such violence touching his own family kept him awake at night. "We need to stop them before they hit something bigger," he told Luke, his voice tight with urgency. But the gang was always one step ahead, their movements shrouded in mystery, their motives unclear. For Elise, the fear was becoming a constant companion. She began locking her doors during the day, something she had never done before, and kept Clara close at all times. The Delhaize where she worked felt less like a safe haven and more like a potential target, especially after hearing rumors that the gang had been scouting supermarkets. "I just want to keep her safe," she told Marie, her voice barely above a whisper as she watched Clara color a picture of a sunflower, oblivious to the growing darkness around them. But safety was an illusion in a country where the Brabant Killers operated with impunity, their shadow lengthening with each new crime. Annelies, meanwhile, was digging deeper, her investigation leading her to a retired gendarme in Leuven who hinted at corruption within the police force. "There are people who don't want this case solved," he told her, his voice low as they met in a dimly lit cafe. "Be careful, Annelies. You're playing with fire." She nodded, her resolve hardening. She owed it to the victims, like Freddie, like the countless others who would soon fall, to uncover the truth no matter the cost. As 1983 dawned, the Brabant Killers were just beginning, their early crimes a prelude to the carnage that would peak in the years ahead, leaving Belgium a nation haunted by fear, desperate for justice, and clinging to the hope that the nightmare would end. By the spring of 1983, the Brabant Killers had begun to tighten their grip on Belgium, their crimes growing more frequent and more vicious with each passing month. What had started as a series of targeted robberies in 1982 had evolved into a campaign of terror that seemed to defy logic, leaving behind a trail of bodies and a nation on edge. The gang's attacks, marked by military precision and a chilling disregard for human life, were no longer just about theft. They were about power, fear, and a message that no one was safe. This chapter follows the escalation of their violence through the eyes of Elise Martens, a young mother in Beercel, Detective Pieter de Klerk, whose investigation deepens in Brussels, and Annelies Verhegen, a journalist in Antwerp whose pursuit of the truth leads her into dangerous territory, as the shadow of the Brabant Killers looms larger than ever. The year 1983 began with a string of smaller crimes that hinted at the Brabant Killers' growing confidence. On January 12th, they had already killed a taxi driver in Mons, shooting him in the head to steal his car, which they used in a robbery at a jewelry store in Wavre later that day. The haul was modest, some gold chains and a few thousand Belgian francs, but the murder was a stark escalation, a sign that the gang was willing to kill for even the smallest gains. By March, they struck again, this time targeting a Colruyt supermarket in Halle, a town just south of Brussels. On March 3, 1983, 3 masked men burst into the store just before closing time, their shotguns raised, their voices barking orders in French. They forced the manager, 45-year-old Paul de Smet, to open the safe, but when he hesitated, the leader, described by witnesses as the Giant, a towering figure with a commanding presence, shot him in the chest, killing him instantly. The gang fled with 150,000 Belgian francs, about 3,700 euros in today's money, leaving behind a scene of chaos. Customers screaming, blood pooling on the tiled floor, and a community shattered by the sudden violence. Elise Martens, now 29, felt the weight of the news like a physical blow when she heard about the Halle attack. The Colruyt was just a 15-minute drive from her home in Beercel, a store she had visited countless times with her daughter, Clara, now 5 years old. She had been trying to push aside her fears since the murder of Freddie Martens at the Auberge de Chevaliers in December 1982, convincing herself that such violence was an anomaly, a one-off tragedy that wouldn't touch her life. But the Halle attack shattered that illusion. "It's getting closer," she whispered to her neighbor Marie, as they sat in her small living room, the radio playing softly in the background. Clara was coloring at the table, her crayons scratching out a picture of a rainbow, oblivious to the tension in her mother's voice. Elise's hands trembled as she poured tea, her mind racing with images of masked men storming into her own workplace, the Delhaize supermarket in Beercel. "I don't feel safe anymore," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Marie reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "We'll be okay, Elise. We have to be." In Brussels, Detective Pieter de Klerk was feeling the pressure of the case more than ever. The Halle attack confirmed his worst fears. The Brabant Killers were not slowing down. They were accelerating, their violence becoming more indiscriminate. Pieter, now 39, had been assigned as the lead investigator on the case after the beer cell murder, and he had thrown himself into the work with a single-minded focus that was beginning to take a toll on his personal life. His wife, Sophie, had grown increasingly frustrated with his long hours, the missed dinners, the nights he spent poring over case files instead of reading bedtime stories to their 6-year-old son, Thomas. "You're not here, Pieter," she had said during an argument the night before the Halle attack, her voice sharp with exhaustion. "Even when you're home, you're not here." Pieter knew she was right, but he couldn't stop. The faces of the victims, like Paul de Smet, haunted him, their deaths a personal failure he couldn't shake. At the crime scene in Halle, Pieter walked through the supermarket with a grim determination, his notebook filled with observations. The witnesses, 2 cashiers and a customer who had hidden behind a display of canned goods, described the same pattern. 3 men masked, one tall and broad-shouldered, speaking French with a mix of accents. They had moved with military precision, clearing the store in under 5 minutes, their escape in a stolen Peugeot 504 as swift as their entry. Pieter noted the shotgun shells left behind, the same type used in Beer Cell and Dwerp, confirming his suspicion that this was the same gang. "They're not just robbers anymore," he told his partner, Luc Van Hove, as they stood outside the store, the flashing lights of police cars casting shadows on their faces. "They're killers, and they're enjoying it." Luc nodded, his expression grim. "We need more manpower, Pieter. This is bigger than us." But manpower was a luxury the Belgian police didn't have. Budget cuts and bureaucratic infighting between the Flemish and Walloon regions had left the force stretched thin, a fact that Pieter knew the killers were exploiting. Annelies Verhegen, now 33, was in her Antwerp office at De Morgan when the news of the Halle attack broke. She had been following the Brabant Killers' crimes since the Dwerp robbery in 1982, her instincts telling her that this was no ordinary gang. The Halle murder, coming just months after the taxi driver's killing in Mons, confirmed her theory that the gang was escalating, their attacks growing more public, more brazen. She drove to Halle that afternoon, her camera slung over her shoulder, her notebook already filled with questions. At the Kalruit, she interviewed a cashier, a young woman named Lisbeth, who had been working the register when the gunmen stormed in. "I thought I was going to die," Lisbeth told her, her voice trembling as she clutched a cup of coffee, her hands shaking. "They didn't even care who they shot. That tall one, he looked at Paul like he was nothing." Annelies jotted down the description of the giant, adding it to her growing file on the gang, her mind racing with possibilities. Annelies's investigation was leading her down a dangerous path. She had been digging into the political context of the time, the so-called Years of Lead in Belgium, a period marked by Cold War tensions, far-right extremism, and allegations of corruption within the police and military. She had heard rumors of the Gladio Network, a secret NATO operation meant to resist a Soviet invasion, and wondered if the Brabant Killers' military tactics, their use of diversionary maneuvers, their knowledge of police response times, suggested a connection. She met with a source in Brussels, a former gendarme named Marc Dubois, who had retired after a career in the Belgian State Security Service. Over coffee in a quiet cafe, Marc spoke in hushed tones, his eyes darting to the door. "There are people in high places who don't want this case solved," he told her, his voice low. "The gendarmes, the military, some of them were involved in things they shouldn't have been. Be careful, Annelies." She nodded, her resolve hardening, but a chill ran down her spine. She knew she was getting close to something big, something that could cost her more than her career. The Brabant Killers' attacks continued throughout 1983, each one more violent than the last. On May 10th, they targeted a GB supermarket in Hoelart, killing a security guard and injuring 2 customers as they fled with 200,000 Belgian francs. On September 17th, they struck again, this time at a textile factory in Temps, where they killed a night watchman and his wife, who had been sleeping in the office, before stealing a small safe containing payroll funds. The double murder in Temps was particularly brutal. The watchman, 55-year-old Jan Pieters, and his wife, Maria, 52, were shot at close range, their bodies left sprawled on the floor, a grim reminder of the gang's ruthlessness. The attacks were becoming a pattern. Hit hard, kill quickly, and disappear, often using stolen cars that were later found burned out in remote areas, leaving little evidence for the police to trace. For Elise, the news of each new attack deepened her fear, turning her daily routines into a source of anxiety. She began taking different routes to work, avoiding the main roads where she feared the gang might strike next. At the Delhaize beer cell, her manager, Georges, held a staff meeting after the Temps murders, his voice tense as he outlined new security measures. Locking the doors 15 minutes before closing, keeping a phone by the register to call the police at the first sign of trouble. "We can't take any chances," he told the staff, his eyes scanning their worried faces. Elise nodded, but the measures did little to ease her dread. She started having nightmares, waking up in a cold sweat with the sound of gunfire echoing in her mind, her heart racing as she checked on Clara, who slept peacefully in her small bed, clutching her favorite stuffed rabbit. Pieter's investigation was hitting dead end after dead end, the lack of concrete evidence frustrating him to no end. The gang's use of stolen cars, their careful avoidance of fingerprints, and their ability to strike and vanish made them nearly impossible to track. He had a team of 10 officers working the case, but they were spread thin, chasing leads across the Flemish Brabant and Walloon regions, often hampered by jurisdictional disputes between local police forces. Pieter had begun to suspect that the gang had inside knowledge, someone feeding them information about police movements, perhaps even a mole within the gendarmes. He shared his theory with Luc, who was skeptical but agreed to look into it. "If you're right, Pieter, this goes deeper than we thought," Luc said, his voice heavy with concern. Pieter nodded, his jaw tight. "That's what I'm afraid of." Annelies, meanwhile, was uncovering more clues that pointed to a possible conspiracy. She obtained a leaked report from a retired military officer, detailing the existence of far-right groups within the Belgian armed forces, some of whom had been trained as part of the Gladio network. The report mentioned a cache of weapons stolen from a military base in 1981, weapons that matched the type used by the Brabant Killers: pump-action shotguns, 9mm pistols, and even a submachine gun. Annelies cross-referenced the report with the gang's known attacks, her heart racing as she realized the implications. "If they're connected to Gladio, this isn't just a gang," she told her editor, Jan de Smet, her voice urgent. "This could be a plot to destabilize the country." Jan, though cautious, gave her the go-ahead to pursue the lead, warning her to be discreet. "You're stepping on dangerous ground, Annelies," he said, his tone serious. "Watch your back." As 1983 drew to a close, the Brabant Killers had claimed 5 lives and injured dozens, their attacks leaving a scar on the Belgian psyche. Elise, Pieter, and Annelies, each in their own way, were caught in the gang's shadow, their lives shaped by the fear and uncertainty that had taken root. Elise clung to her daughter, praying they would be spared. Pieter pushed himself to the brink, determined to stop the killers before they struck again. And Annelies chased the truth, knowing that the answers she sought might come at a terrible cost. The worst was yet to come, as the Brabant Killers prepared for their deadliest phase, their violence set to peak in the years ahead, leaving Belgium a nation haunted by terror, desperate for justice, and searching for a way to heal. By 1984, the Brabant Killers had already etched their name into Belgium's collective consciousness, their violent spree in 1983 leaving a trail of death and fear that lingered like a dark cloud over the nation. The gang's attacks had slowed in frequency, but their shadow loomed larger than ever, a specter of terror that haunted every supermarket, every quiet street, every whispered conversation. For the people of Belgium, 1984 and early 1985 became a period of uneasy calm, a deceptive lull that masked the gang's preparations for their most devastating assault yet: the Aalst massacre of November 1985. This chapter follows the Brabant Killers' quieter, but no less sinister activities during this time, through the eyes of Elise Martins, whose fear deepens in Beer Cell, Detective Pieter de Klerk, whose investigation hits new obstacles in Brussels, and Annelies Verhegen, whose pursuit of the truth in Antwerp brings her closer to a dangerous conspiracy, as the nation braces for the storm that is about to break. In Beer Cell, Elise Martins, now 30, was trying to hold on to a semblance of normalcy for her daughter, Clara, who had just turned 6. The past year had been a nightmare of anxiety, with the Brabant Killers attacks in Halle, Hoelart, and Thames hitting too close to home. Elise's job at the Delhaize supermarket had become a source of constant dread, every late shift filled with the fear that the masked gunmen might storm in, their shotguns blazing. She had taken to keeping a small photo of Clara in her apron pocket, a reminder of why she kept going despite the terror that gnawed at her. "I just want her to have a normal childhood," Elise confided to her neighbor Marie, one evening in March 1984, as they sat on her balcony, watching Clara play with a new set of building blocks. Marie nodded, her own face etched with worry. "We all do, Elise. But how can we, with those monsters still out there?" The Brabant Killers had not been idle in 1984, though their activities were less public, more calculated. On February 14, 1984, they broke into a military depot in Vielsalm, a remote town in the Ardennes, stealing a cache of weapons that included submachine guns, grenades, and ammunition. The theft was discovered days later, when a routine inventory check revealed the missing items, but the gang left no trace, their entry and exit as precise as ever. The stolen weapons, particularly the submachine guns, would later be linked to their attacks in 1985, a sign that they were preparing for something bigger. Pieter de Klerk, now 40, received the report of the Vielsalm theft with a sinking feeling in his stomach. "They're arming up," he told his partner, Luc Van Hove, as they sat in their cramped office in Brussels, maps and case files spread across the desk. "This isn't about small-time robberies anymore. They're planning a war." Pieter's investigation had hit a series of dead ends over the past year, the lack of concrete evidence frustrating him to no end. The gang's use of stolen cars, their careful avoidance of fingerprints, and their ability to vanish after each attack made them a ghost in the system. He had begun to suspect that the Brabant Killers had inside knowledge, possibly from a mole within the gendarmes or even the Belgian State Security Service. The Vielsalm theft only deepened his suspicions. Breaking into a military depot required knowledge of security protocols, the kind of information not easily accessible to common criminals. Pieter requested access to military records, hoping to find a connection, but his request was met with resistance from higher-ups who cited national security concerns. "They're hiding something," Pieter muttered to Luc, his frustration boiling over. "And it's going to get more people killed." In Antwerp, Annelies Verhegen, now 34, was following a lead that had taken her deep into the murky waters of Belgium's political underbelly. Her investigation into the Brabant Killers had led her to the Gladio Network, a secret NATO operation designed to resist a Soviet invasion, which had been active in Belgium during the Cold War. She had obtained a leaked report from a retired military officer, detailing the existence of far-right groups within the Belgian armed forces, some of whom had been trained as part of Gladio. The report mentioned a cache of weapons stolen from a military base in 1981, weapons that matched those used by the Brabant Killers. The Vielsalm theft in 1984 added another piece to the puzzle, and Annelies was convinced that the gang's military precision pointed to a connection. "This isn't just a gang," she told her editor, Jan de Smet, during a meeting at De Morgan in April 1984, her voice urgent. "This could be a plot to destabilize the country, to create fear and justify a crackdown." Jan, though supportive, urged caution. "You're playing with fire, Annelies," he said, his tone serious. "If you're right, there are powerful people who won't want this story to come out." Annelies nodded, but her resolve was unshaken. She met with a new source, a former Gladio operative named Eric van der Linden, in a secluded park in Ghent. Eric, a wiry man in his 50s with a nervous tic, spoke in hushed tones, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The gendarmes, the military, Even some politicians, they were involved in things they shouldn't have been, he told her, his voice barely above a whisper. Gladio was supposed to be about defense, but some of us, we were used for other things. Things like this. He slid a photograph across the bench, showing a group of men in military fatigues, one of whom matched the description of the giant, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence. Annelies's heart raced as she tucked the photo into her bag, knowing she was closer to the truth than ever before, but also more vulnerable. The Brabant Killers' activities in 1984 were not limited to the Vielsalm theft. On July 7th, they struck again, this time targeting a small jewelry store in Annelies, a town in the Walloon region. The owner, 62-year-old Henri Dubois, was closing up for the night when 3 masked men burst in, their weapons drawn. They demanded the contents of the safe, but Henri, a stubborn man who had run the store for decades, refused to comply. The giant shot him in the head without hesitation, killing him instantly, while the other 2 gunmen grabbed a handful of gold necklaces and rings, worth about 50,000 Belgian francs. The gang fled in a stolen Volkswagen Golf, which was later found burned out in a nearby forest, a tactic they had used before to destroy evidence. The murder in Annelies was a grim reminder that the gang had not gone away. They were simply biding their time, honing their skills, and preparing for their next move. For Elise, the Annelies attack was another blow to her fragile sense of security. She had been trying to focus on the small joys in her life, Clara's first day of school, her daughter's excitement over a new pair of red shoes. But the news of each new attack brought her fears rushing back. She began having panic attacks, her heart racing at the sound of a car backfiring or the sight of a stranger lingering too long outside the Delhaize. "I can't keep living like this," she told Marie one evening in August 1984, her voice trembling as she clutched a cup of tea, her hands shaking. Marie, who had become her closest confidant, pulled her into a hug. "You're doing your best, Elise. That's all you can do." But Elise knew that her best might not be enough, not with the Brabant Killers still out there, their next target unknown. Pieter's investigation was becoming an obsession, one that was straining his marriage to the breaking point. Sophie had given him an ultimatum after a particularly heated argument in September 1984. Either you start being a husband and a father, or you move out. Pieter wanted to be there for his family. He loved Sophie and Thomas more than anything, but the case consumed him. He had begun to piece together a theory that the Brabant Killers were part of a larger operation, possibly linked to far-right elements within the military and police. He had interviewed a witness from the Annelies attack, a neighbor who had seen the getaway car, and the description of the giant matched what Annelies had uncovered. A tall man, likely ex-military, with a commanding presence. Pieter reached out to a contact in the Belgian State Security Service, hoping to gain access to classified files on Gladio, but his request was denied, leaving him with more questions than answers. Annelies, meanwhile, was facing her own challenges. Her investigation had caught the attention of someone powerful. Her phone had been tapped, and she had noticed a dark sedan following her on her way home from the office. She confided in Jan, who urged her to take a step back. "I know you want the truth, Annelies, but you have to think about your safety," he said, his voice filled with concern. But Annelies couldn't stop, not when she was so close. She met with another source, a retired police officer named Paul Mertens, who confirmed that some gendarmes had been involved in far-right activities in the early 1980s, including training with Gladio operatives. "There was a group of US who believed we were protecting the country," Paul told her, his voice heavy with regret. "But it got out of hand. People died because of it." Annelies left the meeting with a sense of dread, knowing that the truth she was chasing might come at a terrible cost. As 1985 began, the Brabant Killers were quietly preparing for their deadliest attack yet. On May 1st, they struck again, this time targeting a Delhaize supermarket in Braine-l'Alleud, a town just south of Brussels. The attack was a precursor to their later massacres. They killed a cashier and injured 3 customers, fleeing with 300,000 Belgian francs. The violence was a stark reminder that the gang had not gone away. and it sent a fresh wave of fear through the region. Elise, who worked at a Delhaize in Beercel, felt her stomach drop when she heard the news. "It could have been us," she told her manager, Georges, her voice shaking as they stood in the break room, the radio broadcasting updates on the attack. Georges nodded, his face pale. "We need to be ready, Elise. They're not stopping." Pieter and Annelies, each in their own way, were closing in on the truth. But the Brabant Killers were one step ahead, their plans for Ulst already in motion. The attack in Braine Ellalud was a test run, a chance to refine their tactics for the massacre that would come in November 1985, a day that would mark the darkest chapter in their reign of terror. For Elise, the fear was becoming unbearable, her every day a struggle to protect Clara from a threat she couldn't see. For Pieter, the case was a race against time, a desperate bid to stop the killers before they struck again. And for Annelies, the truth was within reach, but so was the danger, as the Brabant Killers prepared to unleash their full fury, leaving Belgium a nation on the brink, its people clinging to the hope that justice would prevail. On November 9, 1985, the Brabant Killers unleashed their most devastating attack yet, a massacre at the Delhaize supermarket in Ulst that would mark the darkest chapter of their reign of terror in Belgium. The gang's violence, which had been building for 3 years, reached its horrifying peak, claiming 8 lives, including children, and leaving a nation in shock. The Ulst attack was not just a robbery, it was a deliberate act of terror, a message that no one was safe, not even in the most mundane of places. This chapter captures the horror of that day through the eyes of Elise Martens, whose worst fears come true, Detective Pieter de Klerk, whose investigation is pushed to the brink, and Annelies Verhegen, whose pursuit of the truth becomes more dangerous than ever, as the Brabant Killers cement their legacy as Belgium's most feared criminals. Elise Martens, now 31, had been living in a state of constant dread for months, the Brabant Killers' attacks in 1983 and early 1985 haunting her every step. Her job at the Delhaize supermarket in Beercel had become a daily test of courage, but she had no choice. She needed the money to support her daughter, Clara, now 7 years old. Elise had heard about the gang's attack on the Delhaize in Braine Ellalud in May 1985, where they killed a cashier and injured 3 customers, and the news had left her shaken. She had begged her manager, Georges, to hire security guards, but the store's budget was tight, and her pleas went unanswered. "We just have to be careful," Georges had told her, his voice heavy with resignation. But careful wasn't enough, not against a gang that killed without hesitation. On the evening of November 9th, Elise was visiting her sister, Sophie, in Ulst, a town about 30 kilometers northwest of Beercel. Sophie had invited Elise and Clara for dinner, a rare treat that Elise hoped would lift her spirits. After dinner, they decided to stop by the Delhaize supermarket on Parkland in Ulst to pick up some dessert, a decision that would change their lives forever. It was just after 7:30 p.m. when Elise, Sophie, and Clara walked into the store, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the aisles. Clara, clutching her mother's hand, pointed excitedly at a display of chocolate cakes, her laughter a brief moment of joy in Elise's tense world. But that joy was shattered in an instant when the sound of gunfire erupted from the entrance, followed by screams that echoed through the store. 3 masked men stormed into the Delhaize, their weapons raised, their movements swift and coordinated. The leader, the giant, a towering figure in a black balaclava, fired a burst from his submachine gun into the ceiling, sending plaster raining down as customers screamed and dove for cover. "Everyone down now," he shouted in French, his voice cold and commanding. The other 2 gunmen, one armed with a shotgun, the other with a pistol, fanned out, their eyes scanning the aisles for any sign of resistance. Elise grabbed Clara and pulled her behind a display of canned goods, her heart pounding as she whispered, "Stay quiet, baby, please." Sophie, who had been a few steps ahead, dropped to the floor near the checkout, her hands over her head, her eyes wide with terror. The Brabant Killers moved with ruthless efficiency, their target the store's safe, but their actions went far beyond a simple robbery. They began firing indiscriminately, their bullets tearing through the air. striking anyone in their path. A father, 42-year-old Mark Van Dam, was shot in the chest as he tried to shield his 9-year-old daughter, Ank, who screamed as her father fell. The giant turned toward the sound, his eyes locking onto Ank, and without hesitation, he fired again, the bullet striking the girl in the head, killing her instantly. The brutality was staggering. Within minutes, the gang had killed 8 people, including a 14-year-old boy, a 65-year-old grandmother, and a young couple who had been shopping for their wedding. The store was a scene of carnage, blood pooling on the tiled floor, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the sound of anguished cries. Elise held Clara close, her body trembling as she tried to shield her daughter from the horror unfolding around them. She could hear the gunmen shouting orders to the manager, demanding the safe be opened, but their voices were drowned out by the screams of the wounded. Clara whimpered, her small hands clutching Elise's coat, and Elise whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart, we're going to be okay," even as she feared they wouldn't survive. The attack lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The gang grabbed 700,000 Belgian francs, about 17,000 euros in today's money, and fled in a stolen Volkswagen Golf, leaving behind a trail of devastation. As the sound of their car faded into the distance, Elise peeked out from behind the display, her heart breaking at the sight of the bodies scattered across the aisles, the survivors sobbing as they held their loved ones. Pieter de Klerk was at home in Brussels, trying to salvage a rare evening with his family, when his phone rang. His wife, Sophie, shot him a look of frustration as he answered, but her expression softened when she saw the color drain from his face. "It's Alst," Luc Van Hove said on the other end, his voice tight with urgency. "They hit the Delhaize. 8 dead, including kids. It's a massacre." Pieter was on his way to Alst within minutes, his mind racing as he drove through the dark, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. He had known the Brabant Killers were planning something big. He had seen the signs in their theft of military weapons in Wielsam, their attack in Braine-l'Alleud, but he hadn't been able to stop them. "This is on me," he muttered to himself, his hands gripping the steering wheel, his eyes burning with unshed tears. At the crime scene, Pieter walked through the Delhaize, his stomach churning at the sight of the bodies, the blood, the shattered lives. The survivors were in shock, some clinging to each other, others staring blankly at the walls, unable to process what had happened. He spoke to a cashier, 19-year-old Lisbeth, who had hidden behind the counter and survived. "They didn't care who they killed," she told him, her voice trembling, her hands shaking as she clutched a blanket a paramedic had given her. "That tall one, the leader, he shot a little girl like it was nothing." Pieter nodded, his jaw tight, the description of the giant, matching what he had heard before, a tall, broad-shouldered man, likely ex-military, with a commanding presence. He collected evidence, shotgun shells, bullet casings, a partial footprint in the blood, and vowed to himself that he would find them, no matter what it took. Annelies Verhegen was in her Antwerp apartment, working late on her investigation into the Brabant Killers, when the news of the Alst attack broke on the radio. She felt a chill run down her spine as the reporter described the massacre, the death toll, the sheer brutality of it all. She knew immediately that this was the gang she had been tracking, the same men she believed were connected to the Gladio network and far-right elements within the Belgian military. She drove to Alst that night, arriving just after midnight, her camera and notebook in hand. The scene outside the Delhaize was chaotic. Police cars, ambulances, reporters, and grieving families, their cries echoing in the cold night air. Annelies spoke to a survivor, a 30-year-old man named Koen, who had lost his wife in the attack. "She was just buying milk," he said, his voice breaking as he held a photo of her, his hands trembling. Why did they have to kill her? The Alst massacre sent shockwaves through Belgium, the nation reeling from the scale of the violence. Supermarkets across the country began closing early, some hiring armed guards, others installing panic buttons and reinforced doors. The public outcry was immediate. Protests erupted in Brussels, with citizens demanding answers, demanding justice. "How can this happen?" a mother shouted at a rally, her voice raw with grief, holding a sign that read, "Protect our children." The government promised action, forming a special task force to hunt the Brabant Killers. But the gang had vanished, their getaway car found burned out in a nearby forest, just as they had done before. The lack of leads, the lack of progress, only deepened the public's fear and frustration, a sentiment shared by Elise, Pieter, and Annelies, each of whom was forever changed by that day. For Elise, the Ulst attack was a nightmare she had survived, but at a terrible cost. She and Clara had made it out alive, but Sophie had been shot in the leg, her injury leaving her with a permanent limp. Elise was haunted by the memory of Ank, the 9-year-old girl killed in front of her father, her screams echoing in Elise's dreams. She quit her job at the Delhaize beer cell, unable to set foot in a supermarket without trembling, and took a lower-paying job as a seamstress, working from home to be closer to Clara. "I can't lose her," she told Marie, her voice breaking as she held her daughter close, the trauma of Ulst a wound that would never fully heal. Pieter's resolve hardened in the wake of the massacre, but so did the strain on his marriage. Sophie, seeing the toll the case was taking on him, begged him to step back. "You're killing yourself, Pieter," she said, her voice soft but firm, as they sat in their kitchen the night after the attack, Thomas asleep upstairs. "And you're not here for us." Pieter wanted to argue, to tell her he couldn't stop, not now, but he saw the pain in her eyes and nodded, promising to try. But deep down, he knew he couldn't let go. The faces of the Ulst victims, especially Ank, drove him forward, a reminder of the justice he had yet to deliver. Annelies, meanwhile, was more determined than ever to uncover the truth. The Ulst attack confirmed her suspicions that the Brabant Killers were part of a larger conspiracy, their violence a tool to sow fear and chaos. She had a lead on a former gendarme, a man named Michel Lauwers, who had been part of a far-right group in the 1980s and might know the identity of the giant. She arranged to meet him in a small cafe in Liège, but as she drove there, she noticed a dark sedan following her, the same car she had seen before. Her heart raced as she realized the danger she was in, but she couldn't turn back, not now, not when the truth was so close. The Ulst massacre had changed everything for Elise, for Pieter, for Annelies, and for Belgium, a nation now united in grief, fear, and a desperate hope that the nightmare would end. The Ulst massacre on November 9, 1985, marked the zenith of the Brabant Killers' reign of terror, a brutal crescendo that left Belgium reeling with grief and fear. In the days, months, and years that followed, the gang vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, their silence a haunting echo that deepened the nation's trauma. For the survivors, the investigators, and the journalists who had been drawn into the case, the absence of the killers did not bring peace. It brought a new kind of torment, a limbo of unanswered questions and unhealed wounds. This chapter follows the aftermath of Ulst through the eyes of Elise Martens, whose life is forever altered by the trauma, Detective Pieter de Klerk, whose investigation faces new challenges, and Annelies Verhegen, whose pursuit of the truth leads her into ever more dangerous territory, as Belgium struggles to move forward while the shadow of the Brabant Killers lingers. In Beercel, Elise Martens, now 31, was a shell of the woman she had once been. The Ulst massacre had shattered her sense of safety, leaving her with nightmares that replayed the horror of that night. The gunfire, the screams, the sight of 9-year-old Ank's lifeless body on the supermarket floor. Elise and her daughter, Clara, now 7, had survived, but her sister, Sophie, had been shot in the leg, a wound that left her with a permanent limp and a deep well of bitterness. Elise had quit her job at the Delhaize Beercel the day after the attack, unable to face the fluorescent lights and crowded aisles without trembling. She took a job as a seamstress working from home, her small apartment filled with the hum of her sewing machine and the sound of Clara's laughter. A fragile attempt to rebuild a life that felt irrevocably broken. "I can't stop seeing it," she confessed to her neighbor Marie, one evening in December 1985, her voice barely above a whisper as she clutched a cup of tea, her hands shaking. "Every time I close my eyes, I'm back there." Clara, too, was struggling, though she tried to hide it. The once bubbly 7-year-old had become quiet, her drawings now filled with dark scribbles instead of the rainbows she used to love. She clung to Elise at night, refusing to sleep alone, her small voice asking, "Are the bad men coming back, Mama?" Elise didn't know how to answer. She wanted to promise safety, but the Brabant Killers were still out there, their disappearance after Alst offering no comfort. Elise began seeing a therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Lennartz, who helped her navigate the trauma, teaching her breathing exercises to manage her panic attacks. "You survived, Elise," Dr. Lennartz told her during a session in early 1986, her voice gentle but firm. "That's a strength you can build on." Elise nodded, but the fear remained, a constant companion that colored every moment of her life. In Brussels, Detective Pieter de Klerk, now 41, was grappling with the weight of his failure to stop the Alst massacre. The attack had claimed 8 lives, including children, and the public outcry had been immediate and fierce. Protests erupted across Belgium, with citizens demanding answers, demanding justice. Pieter felt the pressure from all sides, his superiors, the media, the grieving families whose faces he saw in his dreams. He had been at the crime scene that night, walking through the blood-stained aisles of the Delhaize, the weight of each death a personal blow. "We should have stopped them," he told his partner, Luc Van Hove, as they sat in their office the day after the attack, the air heavy with exhaustion and grief. Luc, usually the optimist, could only nod, his own eyes red from lack of sleep. "We'll get them, Pieter. We have to." The investigation intensified in the wake of Alst, with the Belgian government forming a special task force, dubbed Cellule Brabant, to hunt the killers. Pieter was named lead investigator, a role that came with more resources, but also more scrutiny. The task force combed through every piece of evidence from the Alst attack, shotgun shells, bullet casings, witness statements, but the gang had left little behind. The stolen Volkswagen Golf they used to escape was found burned out in a forest near Alst, a tactic they had used before to destroy evidence. Witnesses described the giant, the tall, broad-shouldered leader, and his 2 accomplices, but their descriptions were vague, their faces hidden behind masks. Pieter's team chased every lead, from tips about suspicious men seen in the area to reports of stolen cars, but each one led to a dead end, the killers slipping through their fingers like ghosts. Pieter's obsession with the case took a toll on his marriage, which had been strained for years. Sophie, his wife, had begged him to step back after Alst, but he couldn't, not when the killers were still out there, not when he felt the weight of the victims' families on his shoulders. In March 1986, Sophie gave him an ultimatum: choose us or choose the case. Pieter wanted to choose his family. He loved Sophie and their son, Thomas, now 8, but the case consumed him. In April 1986, Sophie moved out, taking Thomas with her to her parents' house in Ghent. "I can't watch you destroy yourself anymore," she told him, her voice breaking as she packed a suitcase, tears streaming down her face. Pieter stood in the doorway, his heart aching, but he couldn't find the words to stop her. The case had cost him his family, but he couldn't let go. Not yet, not until he had justice for Alst. Annelies Verhegen, now 35, was in Antwerp when she heard about the Alst massacre, the news hitting her like a punch to the gut. She had been investigating the Brabant Killers for 3 years, her research pointing to a possible connection with the Gladio network and far-right elements within the Belgian military and police. The Alst attack confirmed her worst fears. The gang's violence was not random. It was a calculated act of terror, designed to sow fear and chaos. She drove to Alst the next day, her notebook filled with questions, her camera capturing the grief etched on the faces of the survivors and the families of the victims. She spoke to a father, 45-year-old Johan Pieters, who had lost his 14-year-old son in the attack. "He was just a boy," Johan told her, his voice hollow as he clutched a photo of his son, his hands trembling. "They didn't have to kill him." Annelies's investigation took a dangerous turn in the months after Alst. She had a lead on a former gendarme, Michel Lauwers, who had been part of a far-right group in the 1980s and might know the identity of the giant. She met him in a small cafe in Liège in December 1985, her nerves on edge after noticing a dark sedan following her for weeks. Michel, a wiry man in his 40s with a scar across his cheek, spoke in hushed tones, his eyes darting to the door. "I knew some of the guys involved," he told her, his voice low. "They were ex-gendarmes trained by Gladio. They called themselves patriots, but they were just killers. The giant, his name was Christian Bonkowski. He was one of us." Annelies's heart raced as she wrote down the name, knowing she had a breakthrough, but also knowing the danger it brought. As she left the cafe, the dark sedan was waiting, its driver watching her with cold eyes, a warning she couldn't ignore. The Brabant Killers' disappearance after Ulst did not bring relief. It deepened the mystery, fueling speculation and conspiracy theories. Some believed the gang had been disbanded, their mission, whatever it was, complete. Others thought they had gone underground, waiting for the heat to die down. Annelies's research suggested a darker possibility, that the gang had been protected, their crimes covered up by powerful figures who wanted the truth to stay buried. She published a series of articles in De Morgan in 1986, detailing her findings on the Gladio connection and naming Christian Bonkowski as a possible suspect. The articles caused a firestorm, with some praising her courage and others accusing her of spreading conspiracy theories. She received anonymous threats, letters, phone calls, a brick thrown through her apartment window, but she refused to back down. "The truth matters," she told her editor, Jan de Smet, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. "For the victims, for their families, it matters." In the years that followed, the investigation into the Brabant Killers became one of Belgium's most enduring mysteries. Pieter's task force worked tirelessly, following leads that took them across the country and even into France and the Netherlands, but the trail grew cold. In 1987, a new lead emerged. A witness claimed to have seen a man matching the giant's description at a shooting range in Wallonia, but when Pieter's team investigated, the man had disappeared, leaving behind only rumors and dead ends. The case began to fade from the public eye, overshadowed by other news, but for those touched by the gang's violence, the pain remained raw. Memorials were held in Ulst each year on November 9th, with families gathering to lay flowers at the site of the massacre, their grief a silent testament to the justice they still sought. Elise, Pieter, and Annelies each carried the weight of the Brabant Killers in their own way. Elise focused on rebuilding her life, finding solace in her work as a seamstress and in Clara's small victories, her daughter's first school play, her laughter as they baked cookies together. But the fear never fully left her, a shadow that lingered in the corners of her mind. Pieter threw himself into the investigation, even as it cost him his marriage, his determination to find the killers a promise he couldn't break. Annelies continued her pursuit of the truth, her articles keeping the case alive in the public consciousness, even as the threats against her grew more menacing. The Brabant Killers had gone silent, but their legacy of terror endured, a wound on the soul of Belgium that would not heal until justice was served, a hope that, for now, remained just out of reach. By April 2025, 4 decades had passed since the Brabant Killers terrorized Belgium, their violent spree between 1982 and 1985, leaving 28 dead and a nation forever changed. The Ulst massacre of November 1985, the gang's deadliest attack, had marked the peak of their reign, but their sudden disappearance afterward left a void filled with questions, grief, and a lingering fear that justice might never be served. In 2017, a breakthrough, the deathbed confession of Christian Bonkowski, a former gendarme who claimed to be the giant, offered a glimmer of hope, but it also deepened the mystery, raising more questions than answers. This final chapter reflects on the long-term impact of the Brabant Killers through the eyes of Elise Martens, now a grandmother in Beersel, Detective Pieter de Klerk, retired but still haunted in Brussels, and Annelies Verhegen, a seasoned journalist in Antwerp, as they confront the past and find a measure of peace in a case that shaped their lives. Elise Martens, now 71, had spent the last 40 years trying to outrun the shadow of the Ulst massacre. The trauma of that night in 1985, when she and her daughter, Clara, survived, but her sister, Sophie, was injured and 8 others were killed, had never fully left her. She had raised Clara, now 47, with a fierce determination to give her a life free of fear. But the memories lingered, surfacing in quiet moments. Elise had become a seamstress after quitting her job at the Delhaize, building a small business that allowed her to work from home, her hands steady as she stitched dresses and curtains, her mind often drifting to the past. Clara had grown into a strong, compassionate woman, a schoolteacher with 2 children of her own, and Elise found joy in her grandchildren, 10-year-old Emma and 7-year-old Lucas, who filled her small beer cell apartment with laughter. In 2017, when news broke of Christian Bonkowski's confession, Elise felt a mix of hope and dread. Bonkowski, a former gendarme, had confessed to his brother on his deathbed, saying, "I was the giant. I was part of the Brabant Killers." The confession, reported by De Morgan, sent shockwaves through Belgium, reigniting interest in the case. Elise watched the news with Clara, her heart racing as she saw Bonkowski's photo, a tall, broad-shouldered man who matched the description of the giant she had seen in Aalst. Could it really be him? Clara asked, her voice soft as she squeezed her mother's hand. Elise nodded, tears in her eyes. "I hope so, sweetheart. I hope they finally get justice for those we lost." But the confession came with complications. Bonkowski was dead, and the evidence linking him to the crimes was circumstantial, leaving Elise with a bittersweet sense of closure. A step forward, but not the end she had hoped for. Pieter de Klerk, now 81, had retired from the Belgian Federal Police in 2005, but the Brabant Killers case had never left him. As the lead investigator of the Cellular Brabant Task Force in the 1980s, he had dedicated years to hunting the killers, a pursuit that cost him his marriage to Sophie and strained his relationship with his son, Thomas, now 48. Pieter lived alone in a small apartment in Brussels, his walls lined with books and faded photos of Thomas as a child, a reminder of the family he had lost to his obsession. The case files, though officially closed for him, still sat in a box in his closet, their pages yellowed but their weight as heavy as ever. He had followed every development in the case over the years, from the discovery of a weapons cache in 1989 to the arrest of a minor suspect in 1998, each lead a flicker of hope that quickly faded. Bonkowski's confession in 2017 brought Pieter back to the case with a renewed sense of purpose. He contacted his old partner, Luc Van Hove, now also retired, and together they reviewed the evidence, comparing Bonkowski's profile to the descriptions of the giant. Bonkowski had been a member of the Diane Group, an elite unit of the Belgian gendarmes in the 1980s, and his physical description, tall, broad-shouldered, with a commanding presence, matched witness accounts. Pieter also learned that Bonkowski had been discharged from the gendarmes in 1981 for disciplinary issues, a detail that aligned with the timeline of the Brabant Killers' early crimes. "It's him," Pieter told Luc, his voice steady but his hands trembling as he held a photo of Bonkowski. "I can feel it." But the confession was not enough. DNA evidence was inconclusive, and Bonkowski's death meant he could not be questioned, leaving the case officially unsolved, a bitter pill for Pieter to swallow after decades of searching. Annelies, now 75, had spent her career chasing the truth about the Brabant Killers, her investigative journalism at De Morgan keeping the case alive in the public consciousness. Her articles in the 1980s, which linked the gang to the Gladio network and far-right elements within the Belgian military, had made her a target, threats, surveillance, a brick through her window, but she had never backed down. By 2025, Annelies had retired from journalism, but she remained a vocal advocate for the victims, speaking at memorials and writing a book, The Shadow of Terror, published in 2020, which detailed her investigation and the systemic failures that allowed the killers to escape justice. She lived in a cozy apartment in Antwerp, her walls covered with awards and photos from her career, a testament to her courage and tenacity. Bonkowski's confession was a vindication for Annelies, confirming what she had suspected for decades. She had named him as a possible suspect in her 1986 articles, based on her meeting with Michel Lauwers, the former gendarme who had identified Bonkowski as the giant. When the confession became public in 2017, Annelies was flooded with calls from colleagues and survivors, her phone ringing late into the night. She traveled to Ulst for the annual memorial on November 9, 2017, where she met with families of the victims, sharing what she knew about Bonkovsky. "We may never get the full truth," she told Johan Pieters, who had lost his son in the Ulst massacre, her voice heavy with regret. "But this is a start." Johan nodded, tears in his eyes, and hugged her, a moment of shared grief and hope that Annelies carried with her in the years that followed. By 2025, the Brabant Killers case remained officially unsolved, but Bonkovsky's confession had shifted the narrative, offering a partial answer to a mystery that had haunted Belgium for 43 years. The Belgian government established a permanent commission to investigate cold cases, inspired in part by the Brabant Killers, ensuring that the victims' families would not be forgotten. Memorials in Ulst, Beersel, and other towns hit by the gang became places of reflection, where communities gathered to honor the 28 lives lost and the countless others changed forever. The Delhaize in Ulst had been demolished in the 1990s, replaced by a small park with a plaque that read, "In memory of those we lost, November 9, 1985, a quiet tribute to the resilience of a town that refused to be defined by its darkest day." Elise, Pieter, and Annelies had each found a measure of peace in their own way. Elise spent her days with her grandchildren, teaching Emma and Lucas how to sew, her hands steady as she guided them through their first stitches. She attended therapy well into her 60s, learning to manage her trauma, and found solace in her family, her love for Clara and her grandchildren a light that outshone the darkness of her past. Pieter reconciled with Sophie in 2010 after years of estrangement, and though they never remarried, they became friends, sharing holidays with Thomas and his children. Pieter visited the Ulst Memorial each year, laying flowers for Ank and the other victims, a silent promise that he had never forgotten them. Annelies continued to advocate for justice, her book a bestseller that inspired a new generation of journalists to tackle cold cases. She mentored young reporters, sharing her notes on the Brabant Killers, her voice steady as she told them, "The truth is worth fighting for." In 2025, she organized a symposium in Brussels, bringing together survivors, investigators, and historians to discuss the case, a final act of defiance against the silence that had shrouded the killers for so long. Elise and Pieter attended, their paths crossing for the first time, a moment of quiet recognition as they shared their stories, their grief, and their hope. The Brabant Killers had left a scar on Belgium, a wound that time could not fully heal, but they had also inspired a legacy of resilience, a determination to seek justice, and a commitment to remember. Elise, Pieter, and Annelies, each in their own way, had carried the weight of the case for decades, but they had also found light in the darkness. Through family, through purpose, through the unyielding belief that even in the face of terror, the human spirit could endure, could heal, and could hope for a better tomorrow. 40 years after the Brabant Killers' reign of terror came to an abrupt end in 1985, their shadow still lingers over Belgium, a haunting reminder of a time when fear gripped the nation. Between 1982 and 1985, the gang killed 28 people, injured over 40, and left countless others scarred by the trauma of their violence, from the small-scale robberies in Dwerp and Beersel to the horrifying massacre in Ulst. The case remains one of Belgium's most enduring mysteries, officially unsolved despite the 2017 deathbed confession of Christian Bonkovsky, a former gendarme who claimed to be the giant, the gang's towering leader. Yet amidst the grief and the unanswered questions, the story of the Brabant Killers is also one of resilience, a testament to the strength of those who survived, those who sought justice, and a nation that refused to be defined by its darkest days. The Brabant Killers' crimes exposed the vulnerabilities of a country already grappling with political and social tensions in the 1980s. Belgium, divided by linguistic and cultural lines, was ill-prepared for a threat of such magnitude, its police forces hampered by bureaucratic infighting and a lack of resources. The gang's military precision, their use of stolen weapons, and their ability to vanish after each attack fueled speculation of a deeper conspiracy. Ties to the Gladio network, far-right elements within the military, or even a plot to destabilize the country during the Cold War. These theories, while never fully proven, left a lasting mark on Belgian society, eroding trust in institutions and deepening the sense of betrayal felt by the victims' families. The failure to bring the killers to justice became a symbol of systemic shortcomings, a wound that reopened with each new lead that led nowhere, each anniversary that passed without closure. For those who lived through the terror, the impact was profound and personal. Elise Martens, who survived the Ulst massacre with her daughter, Clara, carried the trauma for decades, her life shaped by the fear that the bad men might return. Yet she found strength in her family, raising Clara with love and becoming a doting grandmother to Emma and Lucas, her small acts of joy, sewing with her grandchildren, baking cookies on Sundays, a quiet defiance against the darkness of her past. Elise's story is one of survival, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable horror, the human spirit can endure, can heal, and can find light in the smallest moments of connection. Pieter de Klerk, the detective who led the investigation in the 1980s, dedicated his life to the case, a pursuit that cost him his marriage and strained his relationship with his son, Thomas. The weight of the victims' faces, especially Ank, the 9-year-old girl killed in Ulst, drove him forward, even as the case remained unsolved. In retirement, Pieter found a measure of peace, reconciling with Sophie and visiting the Ulst Memorial each year, his presence a silent promise to the families that he had never forgotten. His story is one of justice, a testament to the unyielding determination to seek truth, even when the odds seem insurmountable, even when the cost is personal and profound. Annelies, the journalist who risked everything to uncover the truth, became a voice for the victims, her articles in De Morgan and her book, The Shadow of Terror, keeping the case alive in the public consciousness. Her investigation into the Gladio connection and her naming of Christian Bonkowski as a suspect in 1986 proved prescient. Her courage in the face of threats a beacon for future generations of journalists. In 2025, Annelies' symposium in Brussels brought together survivors, investigators, and historians, a final act of advocacy that ensured the Brabant Killers' crimes would not be forgotten. Her story is one of truth, a reminder that the pursuit of justice, even when incomplete, can inspire change, can honor the lost, and can give voice to those who have been silenced. The legacy of the Brabant Killers is a complex one, a tapestry of loss and resilience woven into the fabric of Belgium's history. The case led to reforms in the Belgian justice system, including the creation of a permanent commission for cold cases, ensuring that the victims' families would not be abandoned. Memorials in Ulst, Biersel, and other towns became places of healing, where communities gathered to remember, to mourn, and to hope. The Delhaize in Ulst, demolished in the 1990s, was replaced by a park, its plaque a quiet tribute to the lives lost, a symbol of a nation that chose to rebuild rather than remain broken. The Brabant Killers may never face a courtroom, their full story may never be known, but their crimes have not been forgotten. They taught Belgium the cost of fear, the fragility of safety, and the importance of vigilance, their violence a stark reminder of the need for justice, for accountability, for compassion. Yet they also revealed the strength of those who refused to be defined by terror. Elise, Pieter, Annelies, and countless others who carried the weight of the past but chose to move forward, to heal, to hope. In the end, the shadow of the Brabant Killers is not just one of darkness, but of light, a light born from the resilience of a nation, the courage of its people, and the enduring belief that even in the face of evil, justice and humanity can prevail.